My son showed up at the house 4 days after we buried my wife. 4 days. Ruth had been gone 96 hours, and there he was at my front door with his wife beside him, a manila folder tucked under his arm, and that look on his face, the one I'd learned to recognize over the years, the one that meant he'd already decided something and was here to inform me of it, not discuss it. "Dad," he said, stepping inside before I'd fully opened the door, "we need to talk about what happens next." I remember standing there in my cardigan, still holding my morning coffee, thinking, what happens next? As if Ruth's death was a project with deliverables, as if grief had a timeline and I was already behind. His wife, Melissa, walked in after him and started moving things around on the kitchen counter, setting her purse down, taking off her coat, making herself at home in a way that always made my stomach tighten a little. She had this habit of rearranging things when she was nervous. I noticed she moved Ruth's ceramic rooster that had sat next to the coffee maker for 22 years. I didn't say anything. I just sat down at the kitchen table and waited. "We've been doing some research," my son began, opening the folder. Inside were printouts, glossy ones. I could see photographs of cheerful-looking dining rooms with round tables and flower arrangements. There are some really excellent communities in the area, places where you'd have support, people your age. I looked at the top sheet, Sunrise Pines Senior Living, starting at $4,200 per month. "I'm 68 years old," I said. "Dad, I ran 6 miles last Thursday. I made Ruth's chicken soup from scratch last week. Well," I stopped. I hadn't meant to say that. The soup had been for her when she was still in the hospital, and she never got to eat it. It was still in the freezer. I couldn't bring myself to throw it out. My son reached across the table and put his hand on mine. "We're worried about you being alone in this house. It's too much for one person, the yard alone. I've kept this yard for 31 years. We just want what's best for you." I've thought about that sentence many times since then. I keep turning it over, trying to find the place where it was true. His name is Theodore. We always called him Ted, though Melissa had started calling him Theodore sometime in the last few years, which told you something. And he was 41 years old that spring, a project manager for a commercial real estate firm in Hartford. He was good at his job, good at looking at things and calculating their value, figuring out what they were worth, what to do with them. I think that's what he was doing when he looked at me. I know that sounds harsh. He's my son, and I love him, and I believe somewhere in there he does love me. But love can wear a lot of different masks, and the one Ted was wearing that week looked a lot like efficiency. The house we were talking about, the house I was apparently supposed to vacate, was on Birchwood Court in Glastonbury, Connecticut. Ruth and I had moved there in 1993 when Ted was 9 years old and his sister Diane was 6. We bought it for $187,000, which felt like all the money in the world at the time. I was 37 and terrified and certain we'd made a mistake, and Ruth squeezed my hand in the driveway on the first morning and said, "We'll grow into it." We did grow into it. We grew our whole lives into it. Ruth's garden was in the backyard. 3 raised beds she'd built herself, tomatoes and herbs, and in the far corner a rose bush she'd planted the year Diane was born. The kitchen had the same yellow curtains she'd hung in 2001 and never changed because, she said, they still made her happy every morning. My workshop was in the basement. 40 years of tools organized exactly the way I wanted them. This was not a house. It was a record of everything we'd been. Ted wanted to sell it. He didn't say that the first day. He eased into it the way he eased into most things, letting it feel like a conversation when it was really a presentation. But I'd spent 35 years as a high school history teacher. I knew when someone was building toward a predetermined conclusion. Over the following 2 weeks, things began to shift in ways so gradual I almost didn't notice them. Ted started calling every day. That alone wasn't unusual. He'd always been attentive, maybe more so after Ruth's diagnosis 2 years earlier. But the calls had a new quality. He was gathering information. How was I eating? Was I sleeping? Had I driven anywhere lately? He asked about the furnace. whether I'd had it serviced. He asked whether I was keeping up with the bills. I answered everything honestly, because I had nothing to hide. I was eating fine. Not great, but fine. I was sleeping about 4 hours at a time, which my doctor said was normal for grief. I was driving. I was paying my bills. The furnace was 2 years old. Then one Saturday he came over with Melissa and spent the afternoon helping me go through some of Ruth's things. That was the word he used, helping. But what he was really doing was inventory. I watched him quietly note the jewelry box, the antique writing desk Ruth had inherited from her mother, the oil painting in the hallway that her friend from her book club had done decades ago. Melissa found the box of Christmas ornaments in the hall closet and made a soft sound of interest. "Some of these are probably worth something," she said, holding up a hand-blown glass ball Ruth had gotten in Prague on our anniversary trip. "They're worth something to me," I said. She smiled and put it back. That night, after they left, I sat in the kitchen for a long time. The house was so quiet I could hear the refrigerator hum. I thought about Ruth. I thought about the early days of our marriage, when we were both teaching. She was an elementary school librarian, I was at the high school, and we'd come home to our tiny apartment and make dinner together, always talking, always with the radio on. She had a particular laugh, quick and unguarded, that I'd loved for 43 years. She'd been gone 26 days. The call I hadn't been expecting came from Ted's voice, but the words weren't really his. "Dad, Melissa and I have been talking to a financial advisor. Given the current real estate market in Glastonbury," he paused, which meant he'd rehearsed this and was now reciting it, "the house could sell for somewhere in the range of $600,000 to $640,000. To $640,000. After fees, that's still a substantial amount, enough to fund a good senior living situation for many years and still leave something for the estate." Estate. He was already talking about my estate while I was standing in the kitchen making oatmeal. "I'm not selling the house," I said. "Dad, we just think." "Ted, I'm not selling the house." There was a pause. Then Melissa's voice in the background, quiet, the words indistinct. Then Ted again. "Can we at least talk to someone together? A neutral third party? There are people who specialize in transitions like this." Transitions. That was a new word. "I'll think about it," I said, which meant no, and hung up. I stood at the kitchen window and looked out at Ruth's garden. The raised beds were bare now, late March. The soil, dark and cold. I'd covered the rose bush for winter, the way she always showed me. Burlap tied with twine. I'd done it automatically, without thinking, just because it was November, and that was what you did. I thought I should call someone. And then I thought of something Ruth had told me, almost exactly 2 years before she died. We'd been sitting on the back porch on a summer evening, the kind of evening Connecticut can do in July when everything settles just right, and the fireflies start up over the grass. Ruth had a glass of white wine. I had an iced tea. We weren't talking about anything in particular, just sitting, and then she said, "Arthur, I want to tell you about something I've been working on." "I should tell you, my name is Arthur. Arthur Neil Beckett. Retired teacher, former cross-country coach, husband for 43 years, father of 2, grandfather of 3. I was a patient man by disposition and by profession, and I'd learned over decades that when Ruth started a sentence with my full first name, she meant for me to listen carefully. So I listened. What she told me that evening took about 20 minutes to explain, and when she was done, I didn't say anything for a while. I just sat with it. Ruth had been quietly, carefully, over the course of 17 years, setting something aside. It had started, she explained, not from distrust or fear, but from something she'd read about in a financial planning book she'd checked out of the school library sometime in the early 2000s. A concept about financial independence. Money that was yours in a fundamental way, separate from joint accounts, not subject to the decisions of anyone else. Her grandmother had kept a private fund, she said, a habit from an era when women understood that security sometimes needed to be built quietly. Ruth had a part-time consulting job for a local nonprofit that she'd taken on after she retired from the library. The income was modest, $5,000–$6,000 a year. Over 17 years, invested carefully in a simple index fund through an account in her name only, it had grown. She slid a single piece of paper across the porch table. I looked at the number. I looked at her. "Ruth," I said. She smiled, that quick, unguarded smile. "I always wanted you to have options," she said. "Whatever happened, whatever anyone tried to do." We didn't talk about it very much after that. It was just something I knew, something that sat at the back of my mind like a key on a hook. You didn't think about it every day, but you always knew it was there. In April, 6 weeks after the funeral, Ted arrived at the house on a Tuesday without calling first. Melissa was with him, and with them was a man I'd never met, introduced to me as Craig, a senior living specialist. Craig had a firm handshake and a rolling bag and a smile like someone had drawn it on with a ruler. They sat down in my living room without being invited to. I stood. "I appreciate you all coming by," I said, which wasn't entirely true, but I think there may have been a misunderstanding. I don't recall agreeing to any kind of meeting. Ted's jaw tightened. "Dad, come on, just hear what Craig has to say." Craig had already opened his bag and was extracting a binder, color-coded. "I have a question first," I said. "Did either of you speak with my doctor about my health or my mental capacity without my knowledge?" Silence. "Because someone called Dr. Owens's office last month asking about whether I'd been evaluated for cognitive decline. His receptionist mentioned it when I came in for my physical." I looked at Ted. That was an interesting thing to hear. Ted's face did something complicated. We were just trying to understand my situation. "Yes." I set my coffee down on the end table. "Craig, I appreciate you making the trip, but I think you've come out here under some false assumptions. I'm not moving into a senior living facility. I'm not selling my home. And I'd like you to know that I've spoken with an attorney, and I'm quite clear on what my rights are." That last part was true. I called my friend George the previous week. We taught together for 15 years before he retired and went to law school, because George was always doing unexpected things, and he'd walked me through everything. My house, my assets, my decisions. Craig looked at Ted, Ted looked at Melissa, Melissa looked at the floor. "I think," I said, "you should call next time." Ted didn't call for almost 2 weeks after that. When he did, his voice had a different quality, quieter, a little wounded. He said he was sorry for springing the meeting on me. He said he was worried about me and it came out wrong. I said I appreciated that and I meant it. But things had changed. I could feel it. My daughter Diane called me around that time. She lived in Oregon, taught middle school science, called every Sunday without fail. She was nothing like her brother in temperament. She asked questions before drawing conclusions, wanted to understand before she decided anything. When I told her what had been happening, she was quiet for a moment, and then said, "Dad, do you want me to come out?" "Not yet," I said, "but soon." What I didn't tell Diane, what I hadn't told anyone yet, was what I'd been quietly doing since that Tuesday in April. I'd called a contractor I'd known for years, a man named Pete Salerno, who'd helped me put in the deck back in 2008. I'd asked him to help me find someone reliable to look at a property. The property was in northern Vermont. Ruth had found it the way she found most things she cared about, slowly, through research, through thinking something through over a long period of time before saying anything about it. She'd shown me photographs once, maybe 8 years before she died. A small house on 4 acres outside of a town called Craftsbury, Vermont, up in the Northeast Kingdom. White clapboard siding, green shutters, a covered porch that ran the full length of the front, a wood stove visible through the window in one picture, an old sugar maple in the front yard that had to be at least 100 years old. "Someday," she'd said then, "when we're done with everything we have to do, I want a place like this." I'd smiled and said someday, and we'd moved on to other things. But Ruth did not move on to other things the way most people did. Ruth made notes. Ruth had a system. When I went through her papers in February, after the funeral, I found a folder in her filing cabinet tucked behind the tax returns, not hidden exactly but private, labeled simply with my name. Inside was a deed. She had purchased that property in Craftsbury 2 years before her death, when her diagnosis was still new and the future was starting to take shape differently in her mind. She'd used money from the private account. She'd paid cash. She'd listed it in her name, with a transfer on death provision to me, which meant no probate, no delays, no one to notify. The deed had transferred automatically when she died. Alongside the deed was a handwritten letter, 4 pages in her careful, looping script, telling me everything about the property, the name of the neighbor, the local hardware store, the best road to take from Hartford, the fact that the porch faced west and the sunsets were something you'll want to see for yourself. She told me she'd driven up there twice, once alone and once with her friend Carol from the library, and that she'd sat on that porch in the late afternoon and thought of me. "I hope you find what you need there," she wrote at the end. "I hope you remember that I knew you. I knew exactly who you were. And I always wanted more of it for you." I read that letter 4 times the night I found it. Then I folded it and put it back in the folder and didn't tell a soul. Through May and into June, I let things settle. I kept the house in Glastonbury looking lived in and normal. I tended the garden. I learned which beds Ruth used for what, planted the tomatoes the way she'd always shown me. I had dinner with neighbors. I went to my Thursday morning coffee group at the church. Ted came by twice, both times with advance notice, both times more subdued. He'd stop bringing binders. The conversations were still circling the same territory. He'd say something careful about planning for the future. I'd say something calm about being fine, but the urgency had shifted. I think he was recalibrating. Meanwhile, I drove to Vermont. I went on a Friday, told no one where I was going, just left a note on the kitchen counter saying I was taking a few days, which was true. I took Route 91 north out of Hartford and watched the landscape change. The highways thinning out, the hills going green, the billboards disappearing. By the time I crossed into Vermont, the sky had that particular quality it gets up there, wider somehow, more room in it. Pete had arranged for a local contractor to inspect the house. Everything solid. The roof was 5 years old. The well was good. The wood stove was original but functional, and Pete said I could upgrade it easily if I wanted. The property backed up to a conservation area, which meant the land behind me was never being developed. I sat on the front porch for an hour that evening. The sugar maple was exactly as it appeared in Ruth's photographs. The light came through it in the late afternoon, in a way that made the whole front yard glow amber. A pair of deer moved through the tree line at the edge of the property without hurrying, not bothered by me at all. I understood why she had sat here and thought of me. I won't describe everything that happened over the following weeks in detail, because some of it is private and some of it is logistical and none of it is the point. The point is that by mid-July, I had made a decision. I called George. We talked through everything, the Vermont property, the Glastonbury house, my finances, my options. I updated my own will. I made Diane the executor. I wrote letters to my grandchildren, not sad ones, just letters telling them things I wanted them to know. I went through the house on Birchwood Court methodically over several weekends. Some things I packed for Vermont, some things I gave to neighbors, to the church, to the Historical Society, which was pleased to receive Ruth's collection of local town records and her volunteer logs from the library. The furniture that had meaning stayed with the house for now. I was leasing it, not selling it, to a young professor and her husband who were coming to teach at the University of Connecticut. They were kind and quiet and seemed genuinely moved by the garden. I kept Ruth's ceramic rooster. I packed her favorite yellow curtains. I took every photograph, every Christmas ornament, the Prague glass ball, the oil painting from the hallway. 3 weeks before I left, I told Diane. She cried, which I hadn't expected. Happy tears, she said. Mom knew, she said. Of course she knew you. She came out the weekend before I left, and we went through things together, and she took a few pieces for Oregon, and we had dinner at the old Italian place on Main Street and talked until the restaurant closed. It was one of the best nights I'd had in years. I told her that. She laughed and said, "Don't tell Ted." I told Ted the day before I moved. I called him and explained simply and without drama that I was leaving for Vermont, that I'd arranged a tenant for the Glastonbury house, that I was fine, that I loved him and I'd invite him up when I was settled. The silence on the phone was very long. "Vermont," he finally said. "Vermont," I confirmed. "You have a house in Vermont." "Ruth gave it to me," I said. Another silence. I heard him breathing. "How long have you?" "A while," I said. "Long enough to know it's right." He didn't come for the move. He called 2 days later and the conversation was harder, some hurt in it, some anger in his voice about being left out, about not knowing. I listened. I let him say what he needed to say, and then I said gently that the decision about where I lived had always been mine to make, that I'd made it carefully, that I hoped, when he came to see me, he'd understand. "We haven't resolved everything. That's going to take time, and I know it. Ted is not a bad person. He made choices that came from a version of caring that got distorted somewhere, through fear or ambition or just the particular shape of his relationship with Melissa, and that's a thing I can hold with some grace now without requiring a full accounting of it. I've been in Craftsbury for almost 4 months now. The wood stove turned out to be more than functional. It's excellent, and I've gotten very good at managing it. I met the neighbor Ruth had mentioned, a woman in her 80s named Agnes who runs a small sheep farm, and brought me a jar of her preserves the first week and told me she was glad someone was living in the White House again. I joined a hiking group at the local outdoors club, which I expected to be perfunctory socializing, and turned out to be genuinely good company. There's a man in the group, Howard's age, named Ray, who used to teach high school chemistry in Massachusetts, and we've started having dinner on Thursday nights and arguing about everything, which I find deeply satisfying. I read on the porch most evenings, until the light goes. The sugar maple has turned now, deep orange and red, the way Vermont maples do in October, almost violent in the beauty of it. The deer still come through the tree line without hurrying. Some mornings, I make coffee and stand at the kitchen window and talk to Ruth out loud. I'm not embarrassed about that. I've lived long enough to know that the people we love don't fully leave us. They just change location. She is here in the curtains I hung in the kitchen window, yellow, just like before. She is here in the ceramic rooster on the counter by the coffee maker. She is here in the 4 pages of her handwriting that I've read so many times now I could recite them. She knew what I would need before I knew I would need it. She built the door before I knew I'd want to walk through it. Ted called last week. His voice was different again, softer, something worked through in it. He asked if he and Melissa could come up sometime, maybe in the spring. I said yes without hesitation. I meant it. Diane is coming for Thanksgiving with her husband and the kids, and I've been slowly learning how to cook things I never bothered to learn before, because for 43 years I'd had a partner who was better at it than I was, and I'd been lazy about it, and now I'm not. I made Ruth's chicken soup last Sunday. The recipe was in her handwriting on an index card in the recipe box I'd brought from Glastonbury. I stood at the stove and made it exactly the way she always did, and it tasted right, and I ate it at the kitchen table with the window open and the smell of October coming in from the maple. And I thought about how far I'd come from that moment 4 months ago when I was standing in the kitchen on Birchwood Court holding a coffee cup while my son told me what happened next. This is what happens next. I decided that. Ruth prepared for it. And here in the quiet of the Northeast Kingdom with the wood stove going and the deer in the tree line and her curtains in my window, I am living it. There's a moment I keep coming back to, not the day my son showed up with that manila folder, not the day Craig and his color-coded binder sat uninvited in my living room, but a quiet evening 8 years before any of that, when Ruth slid a photograph of a white clapboard house across the porch table and said, "Someday." I didn't understand then that someday was already underway, that she was already building it, quietly, without fanfare, without anyone else needing to know. That's the thing about a life lived with genuine integrity. It doesn't announce itself. It just keeps going, one small decision at a time, until one day you reach into a filing cabinet and find that all those small decisions have added up to something that protects the person you love most. Ruth understood something I've been trying to articulate ever since I found that deed. She understood that real care isn't reactive. It doesn't wait until things go wrong and then scramble. Real care is patient and far-sighted and quietly intelligent. She looked at our life together, saw the vulnerabilities I couldn't see, and spent 17 years doing something about it without ever making me feel managed or diminished. That's a kind of moral clarity I don't have words adequate enough for, the kind that puts someone else's dignity above the convenience of just hoping things work out. I think about Ted too, and I try to be honest about it. What he did came from something real. Fear, probably, dressed up in spreadsheets and binders. Fear of watching a parent age. Fear of uncertainty. Fear of a situation he couldn't control. I understand that. What I can't excuse is the way that fear stopped him from asking a single question about what I actually wanted. Not one. Every conversation was a presentation. Every visit was a closing argument. At some point, caring about someone has to include being curious about them. That's what I missed in him, and what I found in Ruth's letter. Curiosity. She was curious about who I was and who I would become after she was gone, and she honored that curiosity by making choices that gave me room rather than choices that constrained me. There is wisdom in that, a kind of practical, unsentimental wisdom that I think gets undervalued. We talk a lot about love as a feeling. Ruth understood it as a practice. Something you do with intelligence over time. As for me, I stayed quiet for months while the pressure built, and I want to be honest that staying quiet wasn't weakness. It was the hardest kind of patience, the kind that requires you to trust in something you can't yet fully see. I didn't know exactly how things would unfold. I just knew what Ruth had built for me, and I knew my own mind. And I held on to both of those things when it would have been easier to give ground. That steadiness, not stubbornness, not pride, just the refusal to be moved by noise when you know what's true. That's what carried me through. I'm 68 years old. I live in a white house in Vermont with a sugar maple out front that turns orange in October like something on fire. I talk to my wife in the mornings. I argue about history with a retired chemistry teacher on Thursday nights. My daughter is coming for Thanksgiving. None of this was handed to me. Ruth built part of it. I built the rest. And the difference between where I am now and where my son wanted me to be comes down to that. People who do the quiet, patient, faithful work of building something real. They always have somewhere to go.